Sometimes, the most important moments in our lives arrive wrapped in the most unexpected packages. Sometimes, courage looks like a simple choice that changes everything forever. At a grand frontier wedding in Wyoming territory, a weathered mountain man walks into the wrong room and sits beside the bride at her own wedding feast. The ballroom goes silent. Everyone waits for the wealthy bride to call for his removal. But she doesn't. What she does instead will shock 200 guests and change both their lives forever. How could one woman's unexpected kindness to a stranger turn an entire wedding celebration upside down? Before we continue, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Grand Imperial Hotel stood like a monument to ambition on the edge of the Wyoming frontier. 3 stories of imported brick and polished oak, it rose above the dusty main street of Ridgeway like a declaration that civilization had finally arrived. On this particular September evening in 1882, every window blazed with gaslight, and the sound of a string quartet drifted through the open doors of the second-floor ballroom. Inside, Catherine Adelaide Thornton stood before a full-length mirror in the bride's preparation room, trying to recognize the woman staring back at her. The dress was a masterpiece of silk and French lace, ordered from San Francisco at considerable expense. Seed pearls traced delicate patterns across the bodice, and the train stretched 6 feet behind her, a river of ivory elegance. Her dark hair had been arranged in an elaborate style, woven through with fresh roses and baby's breath. She looked, by every measure society could devise, perfect. She felt like a stranger in her own skin. "You're stunning, Miss Catherine," Mary Sullivan said softly, adjusting the veil one more time. Mary had been with the Thornton family for 15 years, arriving from Ireland as a young woman and rising to become Catherine's personal maid and, more truthfully, her closest confidant. The older woman's eyes held understanding that went beyond simple admiration. Catherine touched the silver monogrammed napkin that lay folded on the dressing table, a family heirloom bearing the elaborate T crest that represented 4 generations of Thornton ambition. Her grandfather had arrived in Wyoming territory with nothing but determination and a good eye for land. Her father, Augustus, had transformed those early holdings into an empire. The Thornton Ranch sprawled across 40,000 acres of prime grazing land, employed 200 men, and ran 15,000 head of cattle. The family name opened doors from Cheyenne to Denver, commanded respect in San Francisco, and was known as far east as Chicago. It was also, Catherine had recently learned, drowning in debt. "Mary," she said quietly, "do you ever wonder what your life would have been if you'd made different choices?" The maid's hands stilled on the veil. "Every soul wonders that, I expect, but wondering and choosing are different things entirely." Through the floor, Catherine could feel the vibration of 200 guests gathering in the ballroom below. The territory's elite had traveled from as far as 3 territories away for this wedding. It wasn't just a social event, but a consolidation of power, a merger of interests, a carefully choreographed performance of frontier aristocracy. The groom, Gerald Pemberton III, represented Eastern money and banking influence. At 32, he was handsome in a calculated way, with carefully groomed auburn hair and a wardrobe that whispered of Boston tailors and New York sophistication. He'd arrived in Wyoming 6 months earlier to expand his family's banking interests westward, and he'd identified the Thornton Ranch as the perfect foundation for his ambitions. Augustus Thornton had recognized an opportunity when he saw one. What neither man had particularly considered was what Catherine herself wanted. She'd met Gerald at a territorial governor's reception in April. He'd been charming, attentive, well-spoken. He knew which fork to use, could discuss literature and politics with equal facility, and had that particular confidence that came from never having doubted his place in the world. When he'd asked Augustus for permission to court Catherine, her father had been delighted. The courtship had been proper, public, and relentlessly superficial. Gerald spoke of plans and prospects, of the fine house he would build, of the social position they would occupy together. He never asked about her thoughts, her dreams, or what kept her awake at night staring at the stars through her bedroom window. When he'd proposed, he'd done so with a diamond ring and a speech that sounded rehearsed, as though he were closing a business transaction rather than beginning a life partnership. Catherine had said yes because it was expected, because her father beamed with pride, because refusing seemed impossible, ungrateful, and vaguely hysterical, because 28-year-old women on the frontier didn't have unlimited options, especially women who'd spent their youth reading books and dreaming of adventures rather than perfecting the arts of household management and social manipulation. Because she'd watched her father's face grow more lined and worried over the past year, had seen him staying up late in his study, had heard the whispered conversations about investments gone wrong and loans coming due. "Miss Catherine," Mary said gently, breaking into her thoughts, "they'll be ready for you soon." Catherine picked up the monogrammed napkin, feeling the weight of the silver threads worked into the linen. Her mother had carried this same napkin at her own wedding 30 years earlier. Margaret Thornton had died when Catherine was 12, a quiet woman who'd grown quieter over the years, as though she were slowly fading from the world. Catherine remembered her mother sitting by windows, staring out at the mountains with an expression of profound longing. She'd never understood that expression until recently. A knock at the door announced her father. Augustus Thornton was a large man who'd grown larger with prosperity, his beard still more brown than grey, his presence commanding any room he entered. He'd built his empire through shrewd judgment, tireless work, and an absolute conviction in his own decisions. He loved his daughter in the way men of his generation loved, which was to say, he wanted her safe, provided for, and settled. "Catherine," he said, his voice warm with satisfaction, "you look like a queen. Your mother would be so proud." Would she? Catherine wondered. Or would Margaret Thornton recognize in her daughter's eyes the same trapped expression she'd worn in those final years? "The Hendersons came all the way from Montana Territory," Augustus continued, oblivious to her silence. "Senator Warren sent his personal congratulations. Gerald's family has half the banking establishment of Boston in attendance. This is going to be the social event of the decade, Catherine. The Thornton name will be secured for generations." Secured. That was what this was really about. Security, stability, preservation of what had been built. Catherine understood. She even sympathized. But understanding and accepting were not the same thing. "Father," she began, then stopped. What was there to say that wouldn't sound childish, selfish, or worse, romantic? She was being given everything a woman could want: security, position, respect, comfort. That it came without love or passion seemed, in Augustus's worldview, beside the point. Love was for novels. Marriage was for building dynasties. "I know you're nervous," Augustus said, misreading her hesitation. "That's natural. But Gerald is a good man, Catherine. Solid, reliable. He'll provide for you, protect our interests, and build his own empire on our foundation," Catherine finished quietly. Augustus's expression shifted, a flicker of something that might have been guilt passing across his face before his customary confidence reasserted itself. "Partnership, Catherine. That's what marriage is. Partnership." Through the walls came the swelling sound of the string quartet playing the introduction to the wedding processional. In moments, Catherine would walk down that grand staircase, through the ballroom filled with guests who'd come to witness the union of two families, two fortunes, two futures. Mary handed her the bridal bouquet, white roses and trailing ivy, the stems wrapped in white silk ribbon. Catherine's hands were steady as she took it, which surprised her. Inside, she felt like a storm building over the mountains, all turbulence and electricity searching for release. "It's time," Augustus said, offering his arm. Catherine took it. The heavy silk of her gown whispered against the floor as they moved toward the door. Downstairs, Gerald would be waiting at the altar, confident and pleased, ready to claim his bride and the empire that came with her. The guests would smile and nod with approval. The minister would perform the ceremony that would legally bind her life to a man she didn't love. And somewhere in the mountains beyond the town, life went on as it always had, wild, free, and utterly indifferent to the careful constructions of frontier society. Catherine descended the stairs on her father's arm, each step taking her closer to a future that felt like a closing door. The ballroom spread before her, candlelit and elegant, filled with the territory's finest families dressed in their imported best. Crystal chandeliers cast dancing light across polished floors. Tables laden with delicacies lined the walls, silver platters gleaming. At the far end, beneath an arch of white roses, Gerald stood waiting, his smile possessive and satisfied. The string quartet played. The guests turned to watch, and Catherine walked forward into the life that had been chosen for her, the silver-threaded napkin tucked in her bouquet like a talisman, or perhaps a surrender flag. 20 miles to the north, Jonas McKenna had been thinking about soap. It was a simple enough need, but obtaining it required a journey down from his cabin in the high country to the trading post at Ridgeway. He'd put off the trip for 2 weeks, reluctant to leave the mountains during the season when the aspens turned gold and the elk began their autumn migration. But his supplies had dwindled to the point where even a man accustomed to solitude and simplicity couldn't ignore the necessities any longer. Jonas was 35 years old, though the mountains had etched lines around his eyes that made him look older in some lights, younger in others. He stood just over 6 feet tall, lean and weathered like the pines that bent before winter, winds without breaking. His hair, dark brown and usually tied back with a leather cord, hadn't seen a barber in 3 years. His beard was trimmed with his own hunting knife, practical rather than fashionable. He wore buckskin pants and a shirt he'd sewn himself from deer hide, with moccasins that moved silent as thought across any terrain. He'd been a different man once. Jonas McKenna had served as an army scout for 5 years, guiding cavalry units through hostile territory, reading the land the way educated men read books. He'd been good at it, reliable, respected. He'd also been married then, to a woman named Sarah who'd had red hair and a laugh that could lift his spirit no matter how dark the day. Sarah had died of fever 7 years ago, along with the baby she'd been carrying. Jonas had buried them both on a hillside, overlooking a valley they'd planned to homestead. He'd stayed with the army for another year, but something essential had broken in him. The scouting, the tracking, the constant movement, none of it meant anything anymore. So he'd resigned his commission, taken what pay he'd saved, and moved deeper into the mountains than most men dared to go. For 6 years, he'd lived alone. He trapped fur in winter, hunted for meat, grew a small garden in the brief summer months, and spoke to no one for weeks at a time. It was a hard life, but it was honest. The mountains demanded nothing from him except skill and respect. They didn't lie, didn't betray, didn't die unexpectedly, and leave holes in the world that nothing could fill. He came down to civilization perhaps 4 times a year, always uneasy in the presence of too many people, too much noise, too many expectations and social rules he'd forgotten how to navigate. He traded his furs at the post, bought his supplies, and disappeared back into the high country as quickly as possible. This trip was supposed to be no different. He'd arrived at Ridgeway in the late afternoon, surprised to find the town more crowded than usual. Wagons lined the main street, and people in fine clothing moved between the hotel and various establishments with an air of celebration. Jonas paid little attention. Other people's festivities were none of his concern. At the trading post, old Henry Blackwood had been closing up early. Big wedding at the Grand Imperial, Henry explained, counting out Jonas's payment for a winter's worth of prime beaver pelts. The Thornton girl marrying some banker from back east. Whole territories here for it. Even got an invitation to deliver some special furs to the hotel for the bride's father fancy ermine pieces he ordered months ago. You willing to run them over? I was supposed to do it, but my back's acting up again. Jonas had hesitated. He disliked hotels, disliked crowds, disliked the feeling of being watched and judged by people who wouldn't last a week in the wilderness he called home. But Henry had been fair to him over the years, never cheating on the fur prices, always setting aside the supplies Jonas needed. It was a small favor. "Where do I take them?" Jonas had asked. Henry had scribbled directions on a piece of paper, though his handwriting was barely legible. "Service entrance, west side. They'll be expecting someone. Just hand them off and get out before the fancy folks notice you." Jonas had taken the carefully wrapped package of ermine furs and made his way to the Grand Imperial Hotel. The building loomed above him, gas lamps already lit despite the lingering daylight, music drifting from somewhere inside. He'd circled the building looking for the service entrance, his sense of direction confused by the unfamiliar streets and the press of people. He'd found a door on the west side and entered, expecting to find a kitchen or storage area. Instead, he found himself in a carpeted hallway lined with paintings in gold frames. The music was louder here, coming from somewhere ahead. He'd walked forward uncertainly, the fur package under his arm, looking for someone who might direct him to whoever was supposed to receive the delivery. The hallway opened into a landing, and before Jonas fully understood what was happening, he'd stepped into the back of the most elaborate room he'd ever seen. The ballroom was a sea of candlelight, crystal, and silk. Hundreds of people filled the space, all dressed in clothes that probably cost more than Jonas earned in a year. A string quartet played near the far wall. Tables laden with food lined the sides, and down the center, a long aisle led to an arch of white flowers where a man in a black suit stood waiting. Jonas froze, realizing immediately that he'd entered the wrong door. This was the wedding Henry had mentioned. He needed to back out quietly before anyone noticed the buckskin-clad mountain man who'd wandered into their celebration. But at that moment, the music swelled, and every head in the room turned toward a grand staircase at the opposite end of the ballroom. A woman in an elaborate white dress descended on the arm of a large, distinguished-looking man. Even from a distance, Jonas could see she was beautiful, dark hair crowned with flowers, her face composed, but her eyes holding something he recognized from his own mirror, a kind of trapped resignation. The guests' attention was entirely focused on the bride. Jonas saw his opportunity to slip out unnoticed. He began backing toward the door he'd entered, but his heel caught on the edge of a decorative rug. He stumbled slightly, and his beaded buckskin pouch, the one he always carried, containing pine needles and mountain herbs for tea, fell from his coat pocket and skittered across the polished floor. The small sound shouldn't have been audible over the music, but in that moment the quartet was transitioning between phrases. The beaded pouch slid to a stop near the foot of a table at the front of the room. The head table, Jonas realized with sinking certainty. The table where the bride and groom would sit. He'd have to retrieve it. The pouch had belonged to Sarah, made by her own hands. He couldn't leave it behind. Jonas moved quickly but quietly to the head table, trying to remain unobtrusive. He bent to pick up the pouch, and as he straightened, his eyes fell on the place settings, elaborate arrangements of silver, crystal, and china, and one empty chair, positioned at what was clearly the place of honor, directly beside where the bride would sit. From somewhere nearby, a man's voice said sharply, "What are you doing?" "That's not." But the music was reaching its crescendo, and the bride was nearly at the front of the room. Jonas, flustered and uncertain, made a split-second decision that he'd question for the rest of his life. Rather than cause a scene by explaining or arguing, he simply sat down in the empty chair. He'd wait for the processional to finish, then quietly explain his mistake to whoever was in charge, and leave. It was, he would later reflect, possibly the worst decision he'd ever made, or perhaps, in ways he couldn't yet understand, the best. The bride reached the front of the room. Her father released her arm and stepped back. And the woman in the elaborate dress turned to take her place at the head table, her eyes downcast, her expression carefully neutral. Then she looked up and saw Jonas sitting beside her. The ballroom fell into absolute silence. Even the string quartet faltered and stopped playing. 200 guests stood frozen, staring at the impossible sight before them. A mountain man in dusty buckskins and moccasins, smelling of pine smoke and leather, sitting at the head table of the most important wedding in territorial history. Jonas met the bride's eyes, and in that moment, several things happened at once. He saw the shock in her expression give way to something else, a flicker of curiosity, perhaps, or recognition of a fellow creature who didn't quite belong in the carefully constructed world around them. He opened his mouth to apologize, to explain, to remove himself from this terrible mistake. But before he could speak, the bride did something that would be talked about in drawing rooms and saloons across 3 territories for months to come. She smiled. Not a polite society smile, not the careful expression she'd been wearing as she walked down the aisle. A real smile, sudden and genuine, that transformed her entire face and made her eyes come alive with something that looked remarkably like relief. "Hello," Catherine Adelaide Thornton said to the strange man sitting beside her at her own wedding feast. "I don't believe we've been introduced." 3 days passed. The wedding had been postponed, not cancelled, a distinction Augustus insisted upon repeatedly. Catherine had been confined to the ranch house under the pretense of recovering from the strain of the occasion. Gerald visited daily, always proper, always controlled, his anger masked by concern that fooled no one. On the 4th morning, Catherine woke before dawn, dressed in riding clothes, and slipped out of the house while Mary kept watch. She needed air, space, and most of all, she needed to think away from her father's demands and Gerald's cold disappointment. She rode her mare, Stella, into the foothills where the pine forest began to thicken. The September air was crisp, carrying hints of the winter to come. Catherine breathed deeply, feeling her chest expand with something that felt like hope, or perhaps just the absence of suffocation. She'd spent the past 3 nights reading her mother's journal cover to cover. Margaret Thornton had been a woman of deep feeling and quiet dreams, forced into a practical marriage who'd slowly dimmed like a candle burning down. The surveyor she'd loved had left the territory when she married Augustus. She never saw him again. The journal entries grew shorter, more formal, more distant over the years, until they stopped altogether 5 years before her death. Catherine had wept reading those final, sparse entries, and she'd made a decision. She was riding through a stand of aspens when she saw smoke rising from a small clearing ahead. Curious, she guided Stella forward and found herself looking at a simple camp, a bedroll, a small fire, a horse tethered nearby, and Jonas McKenna kneeling beside the fire, stirring something in a tin pot. He looked up at the sound of her approach, surprise crossing his weathered face. He stood quickly, and Catherine noticed he moved with the grace of someone completely at home in the wilderness. "Miss Thornton," he said, clearly uncertain whether to be pleased or alarmed by her appearance. "Mr. McKenna," Catherine replied, dismounting. "I didn't expect to find you still in the area." "I wasn't planning to stay," Jonas admitted, "but I've been thinking about heading back." He gestured vaguely toward the high peaks. "Haven't quite managed to leave yet." They stood in awkward silence for a moment. Then Jonas, remembering his manners, said, "I was making coffee. It's nothing fancy, but you're welcome to some, if you'd like." Catherine tied Stella's reins to a low branch and approached the fire. Jonas poured coffee into a battered tin cup and handed it to her. She took it gratefully, warming her hands on the metal. "Why haven't you left?" she asked directly. Jonas was quiet, staring into the fire. "Honestly, I keep thinking about what happened at that wedding feast. About you. About whether I made things worse for you." "You didn't make things worse," Catherine said. "You made them clearer." She told him then about her mother's journal, about the life of quiet desperation, about the choice between duty and desire. Jonas listened without interrupting, his eyes reflecting the firelight, his expression grave. "My wife," Jonas said when Catherine finished, "was the only person who ever really saw me. Not what I could provide or what family I came from, just me." He picked up a stick and prodded the fire. "When she died, I thought I'd never feel that way again, never feel truly seen." "Is that why you went to the mountains?" Catherine asked. "Partly. Mostly because I couldn't stand the pretense of civilization anymore. All the social rules and expectations, they felt hollow. The mountains don't pretend. They're exactly what they are." Catherine sipped the coffee. It was strong and bitter and somehow exactly right. "I think I've been pretending my entire life, playing the role of dutiful daughter, suitable wife, proper lady. And then you sat down beside me, this complete stranger who clearly didn't belong, and for the first time I felt—" She paused, searching for words. "I felt like I could be honest." Jonas reached into his coat and pulled out something small, carved from wood. He turned it over in his hands before offering it to Catherine. It was a bear, beautifully detailed despite its small size, caught mid-stride as though walking through forest. "I carved this during my first winter alone," Jonas said. "Making it helped me remember that even in solitude, there's still life, still movement, still purpose." He pressed it into Catherine's palm. "I want you to have it." Catherine looked at the wooden bear, feeling the smooth grain under her fingers. "I can't accept this. It's too—" "Please," Jonas said, "consider it a reminder that there are different ways to live, different kinds of freedom." Their eyes met, and Catherine felt something shift inside her, a recognition that went beyond words. This man, this stranger who'd accidentally crashed into her carefully ordered world, understood something essential about her that Gerald never had and never would. "I should go back," Catherine said, though she didn't move. "They'll have noticed I'm gone." "Probably," Jonas agreed. "My father wants me to marry Gerald immediately, quietly, before the scandal spreads." "And what do you want?" It was such a simple question. No one had asked her that in months, perhaps years. "I want to feel alive," Catherine said. "I want to make choices, even if they're wrong. I want to look at mountains and not feel like they're mocking my cage." She clutched the wooden bear. "I want what you have. That freedom. Freedom is another word for loneliness sometimes," Jonas said quietly. "I won't lie to you about that. But you chose it. That's the difference." Jonas nodded slowly. "That's true enough." A sound from the trail below made them both turn. A ranch hand appeared on horseback, scanning the hills. He spotted Catherine and immediately turned back, no doubt riding to inform Augustus of her whereabouts. "I have to go," Catherine said urgently. She stood, still holding the coffee cup and the wooden bear. "Wait," Jonas said. He took the cup from her but left the bear in her hand. "If you ever need—" He stopped, seeming to realize how presumptuous the offer might sound. "I'll be in the high country, northeast of here, about 20 miles, near where Eagle Creek meets the ridge. Most folks know the area." "Why are you telling me this?" Catherine asked. "Because," Jonas said, meeting her eyes steadily, "sometimes knowing there's a choice is almost as important as making it." Catherine tucked the wooden bear into her coat pocket and mounted Stella. She looked down at Jonas, this quiet man who'd shown her more kindness in 2 brief encounters than her intended husband had in 6 months of courtship. "Thank you," she said simply. Then she turned her horse and rode back toward the ranch, toward her father's anger and Gerald's cold demands and a future that felt like a closing door. But in her pocket, the wooden bear pressed against her heart, solid and real. A reminder that somewhere freedom existed, and that perhaps with enough courage it could be claimed. Catherine's return to the ranch triggered immediate consequences. Augustus was waiting in his study, his face set in hard lines. Gerald sat in a leather chair by the window, looking like a judge prepared to pass sentence. "Sit down," Augustus commanded. Catherine remained standing. "I went for a ride. I needed to think." "You were seen," Gerald said coldly, "speaking with that mountain man, the same one who disrupted our wedding." "His name is Jonas McKenna," Catherine said, "and he didn't disrupt anything. I invited him to stay." Augustus slammed his hand on the desk. "Enough of this rebellion, Catherine. I've been patient, understanding even, but this ends now. You will marry Gerald next week. A small private ceremony, no more delays." "I won't," Catherine said quietly. The silence that followed was absolute. Augustus stared at his daughter as though she'd spoken a foreign language. Gerald rose from his chair, his composure finally cracking. "You won't?" he repeated. "After everything, the preparations, the expense, the social arrangements, you won't?" "I don't love you," Catherine said, speaking the truth she'd been avoiding for months. "I don't think I even like you very much, and I won't spend the rest of my life pretending otherwise." Gerald's face flushed red. "Love? You're refusing me because of love? How naive. Marriage is a contract, Catherine. A partnership of mutual benefit. Love is everything," Catherine interrupted. "Love is everything, and I won't settle for less." "Then you're a fool," Gerald snapped. He turned to Augustus. "I assume you'll handle this situation. My offer has been more than generous, considering the state of your finances. But my patience isn't unlimited." The casual cruelty of the statement, the clear indication that Gerald knew about the ranch's debt and was using it as leverage, made something crystallize in Catherine's mind. This wasn't a proposal. It was a business acquisition. She wasn't a bride. She was collateral. "What offer?" she asked, looking between the two men. Augustus wouldn't meet her eyes. Gerald, however, smiled coldly. "Your father owes my bank a considerable sum. The loans come due in 3 months. I've agreed to forgive the debt entirely as part of our marriage settlement. It's quite generous, actually." Catherine felt the floor shift beneath her. "You were going to let me walk into this marriage without telling me it was a financial transaction?" "It's more than that," Augustus protested, but his voice lacked conviction. "Is it?" Catherine asked. "Because it sounds like you were selling me to save the ranch." "Don't be dramatic," Augustus said. "Marriages in our position are always partly about alliance, about everything except the people involved," Catherine finished. She pulled the wooden bear from her pocket and held it up. "Do you know what this is? It's a reminder that there are people in this world who value something more than land and money and social position, who understand that a life lived without choice is barely a life at all." She set the bear on her father's desk. "I'm not marrying Gerald," she said firmly. "Not next week. Not ever. You'll have to find another way to save the ranch." Gerald's expression turned vicious. "Then your father will lose everything. The land, the cattle, the house, everything your grandfather built. And it will be your fault." The words were designed to wound, to manipulate, to force Catherine into compliance through guilt. And they did wound. She loved the ranch, loved the land, understood the generations of work that had built it. But she also understood, suddenly and clearly, that preserving the ranch wasn't worth destroying herself. "If the ranch can only survive by sacrificing me," Catherine said, "then perhaps it deserves to fail." Augustus stood abruptly. "Get out, both of you. I need to think." Gerald left without another word, his face cold with fury. Catherine turned to follow, but her father's voice stopped her. "Your mother," he said quietly, "would be ashamed of you." Catherine turned back, and in her eyes was a sadness that made Augustus flinch. "No," she said gently. "She wouldn't. She'd understand exactly why I'm doing this. Because she made the choice you're asking me to make, and it killed her slowly. I found her journal, Father. I know about the surveyor. I know she loved someone else. I know she spent 30 years trapped in a marriage that was never more than a business arrangement." Augustus sank into his chair, suddenly looking older than his years. She never said I thought we had a good life. You had a comfortable life, Catherine corrected. But comfort isn't the same as happiness. And I won't make her mistake. I can't. She left her father sitting in his study, the wooden bear still on his desk, and climbed the stairs to her room. Mary was waiting there, having heard the raised voices. What happened? The maid asked. Catherine told her everything, the debt, the arrangement, her refusal. When she finished, Mary was quiet for a long moment. You know this means leaving, Mary finally said. Your father won't allow you to stay if you refuse the marriage, and Mr. Pemberton will make sure the social consequences are severe. I know, Catherine said. Where will you go? Catherine thought of Jonas McKenna, camped in the foothills, heading back to his mountain cabin. She thought of the way he'd looked at her, not with desire or possession, but with recognition, understanding, respect. I don't know yet, she admitted, but anywhere is better than a cage, even a gilded one. Mary embraced her then, and Catherine felt tears finally come, not tears of sadness, but of release. She was terrified, but she was also, for the first time in years, truly alive. Outside her window, the mountains rose against the darkening sky, no longer mocking her imprisonment, but beckoning toward possibility. The following morning brought an unexpected visitor to Ridgeway. A lawyer from Denver arrived on the early stage, carrying documents and asking specifically for Jonas McKenna. When he couldn't find Jonas at the hotel, he inquired at the trading post. Henry Blackwood, curious about the well-dressed stranger asking after the mountain man, directed him to the foothills where Jonas typically camped before returning to his cabin. By noon, the entire town knew something unusual was happening. By evening, everyone knew exactly what. Jonas had inherited land. Not just any land, but a surveyed mining claim from an uncle he'd barely known. The claim, located in the high country about 15 miles from Jonas's cabin, had been sitting dormant for 3 years since his uncle's death. But recent geological surveys had revealed something the original prospector had missed. The land sat atop a substantial silver deposit. The lawyer, Mr. Harrison, had spent 2 hours explaining the situation to a stunned Jonas. The claim was legally his. The silver deposits, according to the survey, were worth a conservative estimate of $200,000, perhaps more. Jonas McKenna, mountain man and social outcast, was suddenly wealthier than most of the ranchers in 3 territories, wealthier, in fact, than Augustus Thornton. The news spread through Ridgeway like wildfire. By the time Jonas rode into town the next day to finalize the paperwork at the land office, a crowd had gathered. Among them were Augustus Thornton and Gerald Pemberton, both wearing expressions of calculation barely disguised as friendliness. Mr. McKenna, Augustus called out, his voice warm with sudden camaraderie. I heard about your good fortune. Remarkable news. Simply remarkable. Jonas regarded the rancher with level eyes. He'd spent a sleepless night thinking about what this inheritance meant, about the ways it would change how people saw him. This moment, watching Augustus Thornton pretend they were equals, confirmed his worst fears. Mr. Thornton, Jonas said neutrally. Gerald stepped forward, extending his hand with practiced charm. We may have gotten off on the wrong foot at the wedding feast. I hope you'll accept my apologies for any misunderstanding. Jonas shook the offered hand briefly, noting how Gerald's grip was firm but assessing, as though measuring Jonas's value. No apology necessary, Jonas said. I was the one who sat in the wrong place. Yes. Well, Augustus said expansively, these things happen. In fact, I was hoping we might discuss some business opportunities. A man of your newfound means will need guidance on investments, territorial partnerships. The Thornton name could be quite valuable in helping you navigate. I appreciate the offer, Jonas interrupted quietly, but I'm not interested in partnerships. Augustus's smile faltered slightly. Surely you're not planning to simply mine the silver yourself. The operation would require significant infrastructure, workers, equipment. My ranch could provide. I haven't decided what I'm going to do yet, Jonas said. But when I do, I'll make those decisions on my own. He tipped his hat politely and continued into the land office, leaving Augustus and Gerald standing in the street. As he passed the general store, he caught sight of a small crowd of people, mostly women, whispering behind their hands while staring at him with open speculation. Inside the land office, Mr. Harrison had the documents ready for signature. "Congratulations, Mr. McKenna," the lawyer said. "You're a wealthy man." "I'm noticing that," Jonas said dryly. "I'd recommend traveling to Denver to establish banking relationships. Perhaps consult with mining engineers about the best approach to extracting the silver. There are reputable firms that mining—" "Mr. Harrison," Jonas interrupted, "I've lived 6 years in the mountains, with nothing but what I could carry and what I could build with my hands. I don't need wealth. I never wanted it." The lawyer looked genuinely puzzled. "Then what do you want?" Jonas thought about Catherine Thornton, about the trapped look in her eyes, about the courage it had taken for her to invite him to stay at that wedding feast. He thought about her visiting him in the foothills, about the way she'd held his carved wooden bear like it was precious. "I want to help someone who deserves it," he said finally. He signed the papers, making the inheritance official. Then he asked Mr. Harrison a series of specific questions about property law, debt forgiveness, and anonymous financial transactions. The lawyer's eyebrows rose progressively higher as Jonas explained what he wanted to do. "That's highly unusual," Harrison said. "But legal?" "Yes, it could be arranged." "Then arrange it," Jonas said, "and make sure it's done quietly. No one needs to know where the money came from. Mr. McKenna, are you certain? This is a substantial sum." "I'm certain," Jonas said. "I don't want money. I just want things to be fair." He left the land office and rode directly to the Thornton ranch, though he stopped short of the main house. He found a ranch hand and sent a message asking if Miss Catherine could meet him by the creek that ran along the eastern boundary of the property. Catherine arrived 20 minutes later, riding fast, her face flushed with curiosity and concern. "Jonas, what's wrong? I heard something about a lawyer. About—" "It's true," Jonas said. "I inherited mining land, silver deposits. I'm apparently wealthy now." Catherine's expression was difficult to read. "That's wonderful, isn't it?" "Is it?" Jonas asked. He dismounted and stood by the creek, watching the water flow over smooth stones. "Your father tried to befriend me today. So did your former intended. Suddenly I'm acceptable. Suddenly I'm worth knowing. Because of money I never wanted and never earned." "That's how the world works," Catherine said quietly. "It's a terrible way for the world to work," Jonas countered. He turned to face her. "I came to tell you something. My lawyer is arranging to pay off your father's debts, anonymously. Gerald Pemberton's bank will receive the full amount owed, plus interest. Your father will never know who paid it." Catherine stared at him, shock rendering her momentarily speechless. "You can't, that's too much. Jonas, that's your entire inheritance." "It's about a third of it," Jonas corrected. "And I am. Because you shouldn't have to choose between your freedom and your family's survival. That's not a fair choice." "But why?" Catherine asked, her voice breaking slightly. "You barely know me." Jonas was quiet for a moment, choosing his words carefully. "Because at that wedding feast you saw a stranger who didn't belong, who'd made a mistake, and instead of having him thrown out, you offered him food, you offered him dignity. You risked everything, your reputation, your engagement, your father's approval to show basic human kindness." He stepped closer, his eyes holding hers. "Because when I look at you, I see someone who deserves to make her own choices. And because I know what it's like to lose someone you love and spend years wishing you'd done things differently. I won't stand by and watch you sacrifice yourself when I have the means to prevent it." Catherine's eyes filled with tears. "This is too much. It's too generous. I don't know how to—" You don't have to do anything, Jonas said. Just be free, that's all. Make whatever choices you want. Stay, leave, marry someone you actually love. Never marry at all. Just be free. What about you? Catherine asked. What will you do? Jonas looked toward the mountains, then back at Catherine. I don't know yet. The lawyer thinks I should move to Denver, become a businessman, join society. He smiled slightly. I think I'll probably just go back to my cabin. Maybe hire someone to handle the mining operation while I live my life the way I choose. That's very wise, Catherine said softly, or very foolish. I'm not sure which. Maybe both, Jonas agreed. They stood by the creek in comfortable silence, the afternoon sun warm on their faces. Catherine held out her hand, and Jonas took it. Their fingers intertwined, and neither spoke of the connection that had formed between them, unexpected, impossible, real. Thank you, Catherine finally said, for seeing me, for helping me, for sitting in the wrong chair. Jonas finished, and they both smiled. Whatever came next, whatever choices Catherine made, she would make them freely, and for Jonas, that was worth more than all the silver in the mountains. The anonymous payment reached Gerald Pemberton's bank 3 days later. A wire transfer from a Denver financial institution, no name attached, covering the full amount of Augustus Thornton's debt plus accrued interest. The banker's face went through a remarkable range of expressions when he received the notification: confusion, disbelief, frustration, and finally, cold fury. Someone had removed his leverage. The carefully constructed trap had been dismantled. Augustus received the news that afternoon. His debt, carried for 18 months like a millstone, was simply gone, paid in full by an anonymous benefactor. He sat in his study for 2 hours, staring at the bank's confirmation letter, trying to understand what had happened. Then he looked at the small wooden bear still sitting on his desk, the one Catherine had left there, and understanding dawned. "Mary," he called out, his voice tight. "Where is Catherine?" "In her room, sir," Mary replied, appearing in the doorway. "Tell her I need to speak with her. Now." Catherine arrived within minutes, her expression composed but wary. She'd been expecting this conversation since Jonas had told her what he planned to do. "Did you know?" Augustus demanded without preamble. "About McKenna paying off my debt?" "Yes," Catherine said simply. There was no point in lying. "How much did you tell him? How much does he know about our financial situation?" "I told him nothing," Catherine said. "He figured it out himself. Or perhaps Gerald made it obvious during that charming conversation in your study, the one where he mentioned your loans coming due." Augustus had the grace to look uncomfortable. "Catherine, I know you're angry about the arrangement with Gerald, but you have to understand—" "I understand perfectly," Catherine interrupted. "You were going to trade me to save the ranch, and now someone has saved the ranch without requiring me as payment. You should be grateful." "Grateful?" Augustus's voice rose. "That mountain man paid off a debt of $60,000. Do you have any idea what that means? What he'll expect in return?" Catherine's eyes flashed. "He expects nothing. That's what makes him different from men like Gerald. From men like—" She stopped herself, but the implication hung in the air. "From men like me," Augustus finished quietly. He sank into his chair, suddenly looking every one of his 56 years. "Is that what you think of me? That I would sell my daughter?" "What else should I think?" Catherine asked, though her voice had softened. "You arranged a marriage to a man I didn't love, knowing he was using me as collateral. You didn't ask what I wanted, you just decided." "I was trying to save everything your grandfather built," Augustus said. "Everything I've worked for. The ranch, the land, our name. I was trying to protect you. By trapping me in a loveless marriage?" Augustus picked up the wooden bear, turning it over in his large hands. "Your mother gave me something similar once. In the early years of our marriage, a small carved bird. She said it reminded her of freedom." He looked up at Catherine, his eyes haunted. Catherine sat down across from her father, seeing him clearly, perhaps for the first time. Not as the powerful rancher who commanded respect across 3 territories, but as a man who'd built an empire and missed the person living beside him. She loved someone else, Catherine said gently. Before you. Did you know? Augustus nodded slowly. I suspected she would get a certain look sometimes, especially when the railroad surveyors came through. Distant, sad. I told myself it didn't matter, that respect and partnership were enough. He set down the bear. I was wrong. What are you going to do? Catherine asked. About Jonas, about me. What do you want me to do? It was the first time in months her father had asked her that question. Catherine took a breath. I want your blessing, she said. To live my own life. Make my own choices, even if you don't approve of them. And if those choices involve McKenna, they might, Catherine admitted. I don't know yet. We've barely spoken beyond those few encounters. But I know he sees me as a person, not a possession. He values my freedom more than his own comfort. That's more than Gerald ever offered. Augustus was quiet for a long moment. He's not suitable. He lives in the mountains like a free man, Catherine finished. Yes. And maybe that's exactly what I need. A knock at the study door interrupted them. Mary appeared, looking worried. Mr. Thornton, Mr. Pemberton is here. He's asking to see both you and Miss Catherine. He seems agitated. Augustus and Catherine exchanged glances. Show him in, Augustus said. Gerald entered like a storm, his usual composure completely shattered. His face was flushed, his hair slightly disheveled, his eyes bright with anger. I know it was McKenna, he said without preamble. I've had inquiries made. The payment came from a Denver bank, but the account was opened 3 days ago by a man matching his description. He paid off your debt specifically to remove my leverage. I don't see how that's any of your concern, Augustus said carefully. The debt is paid. Our business with your bank is concluded. Our business was never just about the loan, Gerald snapped. It was about the marriage, about the alliance. I agreed to nothing that my daughter hasn't consented to, Augustus said, his voice hardening, and Catherine has made her position clear. Gerald turned to Catherine, his expression shifting to something almost pleading. This is ridiculous. You can't seriously be considering what? Throwing away everything for a mountain man? Someone with no education, no refinement, no desire to own me, Catherine said quietly. No need to use me as a business asset. No pretense that our relationship would be anything other than what it is. And what is it? Gerald demanded. You've spoken to him, what, 3 times? You barely know him. I know enough, Catherine said. I know he's kind. I know he values freedom more than wealth. I know he sees me as a human being worthy of choice, not a commodity to be acquired. Gerald's face twisted with something ugly. You're a fool, both of you. McKenna will tire of this rustic fantasy and move to Denver, and you'll follow him like a loyal dog, and in 5 years you'll be miserable and wishing you'd made the sensible choice. Perhaps, Catherine said, but it will be my choice, my mistake to make if it is one, and that's worth more than all the sensible arrangements in the world. This is your final answer? Gerald asked, looking between Catherine and Augustus. It is, Catherine said firmly. Gerald straightened his jacket, his composure returning like a mask, sliding back into place. Very well. Don't expect understanding from society. I'll make sure people know exactly what kind of woman you are. Catherine Thornton. The kind who throws away a respectable engagement for a common labourer who got lucky with a land inheritance. Do your worst, Catherine said. I've stopped caring what people say. After Gerald left, slamming the door behind him, Augustus and Catherine sat in silence. Finally, Augustus spoke. You're serious about this, about McKenna? I don't know what I'm serious about yet, Catherine admitted, but I know I need to find out on my own terms. Augustus stood and walked to the window, looking out over the land he'd spent his life building. Your mother asked me once if I thought the ranch was worth the cost. I didn't understand the question then. I told her of course it was. It was our legacy, our future. She just looked at me with the saddest expression and said, "But what about today? What about right now?" He turned back to Catherine. "I finally understand what she meant. What good is a legacy if you sacrifice the present to build it? What's the point of securing a future if everyone is miserable getting there?" Catherine stood and went to her father, taking his hand. "I'm not abandoning you or the ranch. I'm just choosing yourself," Augustus finished. "Like you should. Like your mother should have." He squeezed her hand. "You have my blessing, whatever you decide, wherever you go, even if it's to a mountain cabin with a man I barely know." "I haven't decided that yet," Catherine said, though she smiled. "But you're considering it." "I'm considering being free to decide. That's all." Augustus pulled her into an embrace, something he hadn't done since she was a child. "Then be free. God knows this family is overdue for someone making choices based on something other than duty." Catherine held her father tightly, feeling years of unspoken tension finally releasing. Whatever came next, she would face it with his blessing. And that, she realized, was all she'd ever really wanted. The question remained, what did she want to do with that freedom? Stay at the ranch, managing the land she'd grown up on, move to town, establish independence, or follow the pull she felt toward the mountains, toward a quiet man who'd accidentally shown her what courage and kindness looked like. She thought about the wooden bear in her room, about Jonas's steady eyes, about the way he'd given away a fortune just to ensure she could make her own choices. And she knew, with growing certainty, exactly what she wanted to do. But first, she needed to ride into the foothills one more time. She needed to see Jonas McKenna and tell him what his gift had truly meant. She needed to know if what she felt was real or just gratitude for being rescued. She needed, for perhaps the first time in her life, to be completely honest about what she wanted. Tomorrow, she decided. Tomorrow she would ride out and find her answers. Jonas kissed her then, gentle and tentative, as though she were something precious that might break. Catherine responded with a certainty that surprised them both, her arms coming up around his neck, pulling him closer. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard, both smiling. "Well," Jonas said, "that was honest." Catherine laughed, feeling lighter than she had in years. "Very honest." They sat back down on the log, this time with no distance between them. Jonas kept his arm around Catherine's shoulders, and she leaned into him, marveling at how natural it felt. "What happens now?" Catherine asked. "I don't know," Jonas admitted. "I've been thinking about it. About what to do with the mine, with the money, about whether to stay in the territory or—" He paused. "And what do you want?" Jonas was quiet for a moment, choosing his words carefully. "I want a life that's real. Not lived in isolation anymore, but not lived in the middle of society's games either. Somewhere in between. A place where I can be myself, and you can be yourself, and we can build something together," Catherine finished. "Something that's ours. On our terms." "Yes," Jonas said simply. "I have an idea," Catherine said slowly, the thought forming even as she spoke. "There's a valley about 15 miles from my father's ranch. Good water, sheltered from the worst weather, meadows for grazing. It's been empty for years, because it's too remote for most ranchers to bother with. But for someone who knows how to live off the land, it could work," Jonas said, understanding immediately where she was going. "A small operation, sustainable, independent. We could build a house," Catherine continued, warming to the vision. "Not a mansion, just a home, run some cattle, maybe horses, have a trading post for the prospectors and trappers. I could teach the children from nearby homesteads. You could guide hunters in the mountains." She turned to look at him. "We could have a life that's ours, simple, but real." You'd give up society, your father's ranch, the life you've known? I'd trade it, Catherine corrected, for something better, for freedom and honesty, and she stopped, suddenly vulnerable. For you, if you'll have me. Jonas pulled her closer, pressing a kiss to her temple. Catherine Thornton, I would build you a palace in the mountains if you wanted it, or a cabin with one room, or anything in between. Whatever you want, wherever you want it, I'll help you build it. Partners? Catherine asked. Partners, Jonas confirmed. They spent the rest of the morning planning, talking through details and possibilities, interrupting each other with ideas and occasional kisses. The sun climbed higher, warming the clearing, and Catherine felt something settling in her chest, not resignation, but rightness. Finally, Jonas said, We should talk to your father, properly. He hesitated. I should ask his permission, or at least his blessing. You don't need to, Catherine said. He already gave it. But you're right. He should hear our plans from us, not through gossip. They rode back to the ranch together, Catherine on Stella and Jonas on his buckskin gelding. As they approached the main house, Catherine saw her father standing on the porch, as though he'd been watching for her return. Augustus's face was unreadable as they dismounted. He looked at Jonas, at Catherine, at their clasped hands. Mr. Thornton, Jonas said formally, I'd like to speak with you about your daughter. I figured you might, Augustus replied. His voice gave nothing away, but his eyes were thoughtful rather than angry. Come inside, both of you. In the study, with Mary bringing coffee and then discreetly withdrawing, Jonas and Catherine laid out their plan. They spoke of the valley, of the life they wanted to build, of their intention to marry simply and soon. Augustus listened without interrupting. When they finished, he was quiet for a long moment. You're sure about this? He asked Catherine. About leaving everything you've known for a life that won't be easy? I'm sure, Catherine said. For the first time in my life, I'm completely sure. Augustus turned to Jonas. You'll take care of her? We'll take care of each other. Jonas corrected gently but firmly. Catherine doesn't need someone to manage her life. She needs a partner. That's what I'm offering. That's what she's offering me. Augustus's expression softened slightly. That's the right answer. He stood and extended his hand to Jonas. You have my blessing, my support. If you need supplies for building, workers, advice, whatever you need, the Thornton Ranch will provide it. Thank you, sir, Jonas said, shaking the offered hand. Don't thank me, Augustus said. Just make her happy. Actually happy, not just comfortable. That's all I should have wanted for her from the beginning. Catherine embraced her father, feeling years of tension finally release. I love you, father. I love you too, Augustus said, his voice thick, even when I'm a stubborn fool about showing it. They talked for another hour, making practical plans. Augustus insisted on giving Catherine part of her inheritance early to help them establish their homestead. Jonas was reluctant to accept, but Catherine pointed out that it was her money, her choice. See how she is, Augustus said to Jonas with a slight smile. Stubborn, independent, good luck managing that. I'm not trying to manage it, Jonas said, looking at Catherine with open affection. I'm celebrating it. 6 months later, spring had arrived in the Wyoming Territory with an explosion of wildflowers and birdsong. The valley Catherine and Jonas had chosen for their homestead was even more beautiful than she'd remembered, a bowl of green meadow surrounded by pine forest, with a creek running clear and cold through the center. The house they'd built together was modest but solid. 2 rooms, a stone fireplace, windows that faced both sunrise and sunset. It wasn't the mansion Catherine had grown up in, nor was it the lonely cabin Jonas had occupied for 6 years. It was something new, something theirs. They'd been married in a simple ceremony at the ranch, with Augustus giving Catherine away and Mary standing as witness. No elaborate guest list, no society spectacle. Just 2 people making promises they intended to keep, surrounded by the few people who truly mattered. Catherine stood now in the doorway of their home, watching Jonas work with a young prospector who'd stopped by their trading post. They'd opened the small store a month ago, and already it was serving as a meeting point for the scattered homesteaders, trappers, and miners in the region. Jonas had a natural rapport with these rough, practical men. He spoke their language, understood their needs, treated them with respect. "Mrs. McKenna," a voice called, and Catherine smiled at the name she was still getting used to. She turned to see Ruth Henderson, a homesteader's wife from 5 miles north, riding up with her 2 young children. "Ruth," Catherine greeted warmly. "Are you here for supplies or for reading lessons?" "Both," Ruth said, dismounting and helping her children down. "Tommy's been practicing his letters like you showed him." Catherine had started teaching the local children to read 3 times a week. Classes were held in the larger room of the trading post, with whatever books she'd managed to collect from town and from her father's library. It wasn't a formal school, but it was something, a beginning. "Let's see what you can do, Tommy," Catherine said, pulling out one of the primers. The boy, 8 years old, with a gap-toothed grin, read haltingly but proudly through a simple passage. Catherine praised him warmly and gave him a harder text to practice with. His younger sister, only 5, wanted to learn too, so Catherine started her on the alphabet. While Ruth shopped for supplies and the children worked on their letters, Jonas came inside with the prospector, who was paying for coffee, beans, and tobacco. "That's a fine woman you've got there," the prospector said, nodding toward Catherine. "Pretty and smart, teaching kids and running a store. You're a lucky man, McKenna." "I know it," Jonas agreed, and Catherine caught his eye across the room. They exchanged a smile that made the prospector chuckle and shake his head. After the Henderson family and the prospector had left, Catherine and Jonas closed up the trading post for the day. They walked back to their house together, hand in hand, as the sun began its descent toward the mountains. 3 families asked if we'd hold a community gathering next month," Jonas said. "Maybe some music, food, a chance for everyone to meet." "That sounds wonderful," Catherine said. "We could—" She stopped, pressing a hand to her stomach. Jonas looked at her with immediate concern. "What's wrong?" "Nothing's wrong," Catherine said, her eyes bright. "Actually, something's very right. Jonas, I'm pregnant." For a moment, Jonas just stared at her. Then he let out a whoop of joy and swept her up in his arms, spinning her around while she laughed. "Are you sure?" he asked, when he finally set her down. "I'm sure. 3 months, I think. I wanted to be certain before I told you." Jonas pulled her close, burying his face in her hair. "A baby. Our baby. Are you happy?" Catherine asked, though she could feel the answer in the way he held her. "Happy doesn't begin to cover it," Jonas said, terrified, excited, grateful, all of it at once. That night they sat on the porch of their home as stars emerged overhead. Jonas had his arm around Catherine, and her hand rested on her still flat stomach. "Do you ever regret it?" Jonas asked quietly. "Giving up the ranch, the society, the comfortable life?" Catherine thought about it honestly before answering. "Sometimes I miss my father, the land I grew up on, the ease of having everything provided. But then I think about what I would have missed if I'd stayed. This," she gestured at the valley, at their home, at the life they'd built. "You, us, the freedom to wake up every morning and know that this life is ours by choice, not by obligation." She pulled the wooden bear from her pocket. She still carried it, though it was worn smooth now from months of handling. "You gave me this and told me it was a reminder that there are different ways to live, different kinds of freedom. You were right. But what you didn't tell me is that freedom isn't just about what you leave behind. It's about what you choose to build." Jonas kissed her temple. "What do you think we're building?" "A life," Catherine said simply. "A real one, where our child will grow up knowing they can make their own choices, where happiness matters more than propriety, where love is the foundation, not the luxury." "That sounds like a good legacy," Jonas said. "Better than the one I would have left at the ranch," Catherine agreed. They sat in comfortable silence as night deepened around them. Inside their home, a fire crackled in the hearth. In the distance, an owl called. The mountains rose dark against the star-filled sky, no longer prison walls, but protective embrace. Catherine thought about the wedding feast that had changed everything, the wrong door that Jonas had walked through, the empty chair he'd sat in, the moment when she'd chosen kindness over propriety and, in doing so, had chosen freedom. "Thank you," she said softly. "For what?" Jonas asked. "For sitting in the wrong seat." Jonas laughed quietly. "Best mistake I ever made." "Mine too," Catherine said. "Mine too." And in the valley they'd claimed as their own, two people who'd found each other by accident and chosen each other by design, sat together in the darkness, building a future from honesty, courage, and love.